Hey everybody, this week we have kind of a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to discuss three topics that are related, but are also fairly distinct from one another. I'm going to begin with a discussion of the unification of Italy and Germany in the 1860s and 1870s. I'm going to move from there into an exploration of imperialism. And then we're going to end with a few thoughts on some intellectual developments at the end of the 19th century, some changes in philosophy. We're going to pick that discussion up again next week. And as you can tell from this week's primary source readings, we're going to be looking at the work of Sigmund Freud, Gustave Le Bon, and this week we're just going to start that by talking a bit about Nietzsche. So let's get into it. One quick point to make, everything we're discussing this week deals with the late Victorian period. You'll remember last week I said the Victorian era is this period that stretches from roughly the 1830s to 1900. It corresponds to the reign of the British Queen Victoria, but also corresponds to industrialization and imperialism and the emergence of industrial capitalism, all of these kind of in urbanization, right? So there's these kind of consistent big picture trends that really define the era. So you'll remember several weeks ago that we discussed the very critical year 1848 when liberal and nationalist uprisings across Europe attempted to challenge the conservative governments that had controlled the continent since the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815. And in almost every case, those revolutions had ended in failure. The political ingredients for those revolutions did not simply disappear. Right? There's all these nationalist uprisings. They were put down. It's not like nationalism was just wiped from the map, right? It's still there. It's still floating around. There are still dreams of creating new and independent nations. And by the 1860s and 1870s, nationalism surged forward again and actually succeeded in two extremely significant cases. Italy was unified as a constitutional monarchy in 1861, and the German Empire was established a decade later in 1871. So this raises some important questions for us, right? What changed between 1848 and the 1860s, the 1870s? What was at stake in these unifications? How did they alter the balance of power on the European continent? So let's start with Italy. For much of the 19th century, Italy, or the Italian peninsula, was a patchwork of small states, small kingdoms, principalities. And as you'll remember, nationalists had long dreamed of unifying all of this under a single liberal constitutional government, right? This is the dream of the Young Italy movement and of Mazzini. And after 1848, when they failed to do this, Italian nationalists believed that their failures were due to the fact that their revolutions had been organized from below. Okay, when I say that, I mean there were mass revolutions, there were popular revolutions. Common people were the energy; they were the force making this happen. After 1848, Italian nationalists increasingly look to power from above. Right, so when we say below, masses, above, we're talking about political elites, the politically powerful, the economically powerful in the society. Okay, so Italian nationalists think if we work from above, that might be a more effective way to unify the peninsula. They want to expand Italy's most industrial and liberal state, the Kingdom of Piedmont, which is in the far northwest of the country, and then use the power of Piedmont to expel foreign influence from the rest of the peninsula, right? So that's really working from above. Who already has power? How can we use that power to accomplish our goal? And crucial to these plans is one figure in particular, the most powerful man in Piedmont, a statesman and minister named Count Camillo Benso di Cavour. Here he is, there's Cavour. Cavour was absolutely not a romantic. Remember we said that nationalists had this sort of romantic urge to unify the nation under a single spirit. Cavour doesn't really think in those terms. Instead, he practices a form of politics known as Realpolitik, right? It's a German word. What it means is realistic, hard-nosed approach to politics. right? Realpolitik is not about lofty ideas. It's not about romantic sentimentalism. Instead, it's strategic and it's about meeting the sort of real, often less than ideal circumstances of the world as it is. Cavour does want unification, but he doesn't think it's going to come from young people racing into the streets, right? Instead, it's going to come from diplomacy. It's going to come from negotiation. It could come from war, all right? So in 1858, Cavour strikes a secret alliance between Piedmont, this northwestern state that he controls, and France, right, which Piedmont happens to border. France has a goal here. France wants to weaken its old nemesis, Austria. Austria has a lot of power in the Italian peninsula. And Cavour has a goal. He wants to add some military heft and power to Piedmont so they can help each other out, right? In exchange for French support, Cavour promises France the territories of Nice and Savoy. Young Italy, right, those earlier nationalists, they never would have gone for something like this. They would have said, no, Nice and Savoy are part of the eternal Italian nation. They're part of our spirit. To give them away is treasonous. But Cavour, he's practicing realpolitik. And he says, well, maybe if we sacrifice these two territories here, we can gain everything else, okay? This map is written in French, so I apologize for that. But here, up here is Piedmont. And then these two striped territories, this is Savoy, and this is Nice right here. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this image in just a second. So Cavour next provokes military conflict with the Austrians to try and spark his plan. And the combined French and Piedmontese military forces, they drive the Austrians entirely out of Italy. And as promised, the French gain Savoy and Nice. And Piedmont has expanded to include most of northern Italy. Okay, so these territories here, this is Tuscany, Modena, Parma, all of these become part of Piedmont quite quickly. All right. And inspired by these victories, there's developments in the South. There's a group of Italian nationalists. They're led by a sort of charismatic figure named Giuseppe Garibaldi. What they do is they quickly capture the island of Sicily here, and then they move from Sicily into the Lower Peninsula, and they kind of storm their way up. They conquer the city of Naples. They overthrow the very unpopular, illiberal king of Naples, and they sort of unify the South. And then in a kind of dramatic moment, Garibaldi presents the south of Italy to the king of Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel, thus unifying most of the peninsula. Okay, this is all in the years 1859 and 1860. So by March of 1861, the unified kingdom of Italy is proclaimed. It's a constitutional monarchy. Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont becomes king of Italy. The country's new prime minister is Cavour. Cavour actually happens to die unexpectedly soon after, but you know, his work is essentially done in having helped achieve this unification. Here we have an image. This is Garibaldi, this caricature, sort of fitting the boot onto the boot representing, of course, Italy, onto Victor Emmanuel. So this is a political union, but there's important cultural and economic divisions in Italy. And if you know much, if you ever happen to have visited Italy or read about Italy at all, you know that there's a pretty strong difference between Southern Italian history and Northern Italian history, and that they exist in conflict with one another. Northern Italy at this point, at the point of unification, was industrialized, it's urban, it's very prosperous. And Southern Italy is none of those things. It's agrarian, it's poor, it's not urban at all, right? Illiteracy in Southern Italy was close to 90% at the time of unification. Most people are very poor farmers. So in the 50 years that follow unification, this problem of regional difference really troubles Italian governance. Right? It's sort of the defining feature of Italian governance is this conflict. And out of this is going to lead a series of crises that eventually lead, at least in part, to the rise of fascism on the Italian peninsula, the rise of the dictator Benito Mussolini in the 1920s, which we're going to talk about as we move forward. Okay, but we do see here, right, the big point is that by working from above through a general like Garibaldi and through this sort of brilliant political tactician like Cavour, Italy is able to achieve the unification that evaded young romantic nationalists in the 1830s. Germany's story is somewhat similar. Okay, let's take a look at this slide before I move into Germany. So Germany's story somewhat similar. When the dust of the 1848 revolutions had settled, Prussia remained the most powerful of nearly 40 small German states, right? German-speaking states, they're cultural states. The king of Prussia was Wilhelm I, and his right-hand man was his chief minister, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was the real mastermind of Realpolitik. Bismarck's dream was a strong, united Germany, but he was also an illiberal ruler. One of his first acts was to dismiss the Prussian parliament when it disagreed with the king over a tax issue, right? He just says, there's no more parliament, okay? So liberals tend to believe in representative government. The parliament is the will of the people. This goes back to the English Civil War, which we talked about, I think, week 1. He has no use for the parliament, right? We don't need a representative government. He is the state, effectively, right? He's continuously censoring critics. In 1862, he outlines his vision of both proper governance and German unification. Right? Here's what he writes. The position of Prussia in Germany will be decided not by its liberalism, but by its power. Not through speeches and majority decisions are the great questions of the day decided. That was the mistake of 1848 and 1849. The great questions of the day will be decided by blood and iron. Okay. Political objectives, in other words, will come from industrialization. They'll come from diplomacy, but if necessary, they will come from warfare. We will shed blood to achieve our goals. Okay. And we will sacrifice our own blood to achieve our goals. If industrialization requires the sort of churning up of German working class lives, so be it, right? Bismarck is an incredibly influential figure. This caricature is meant to sort of poke fun at how many roles he held in Prussian governance. Right? We have the diplomat and the general, and he's the minister to Austria, and he's the minister to this state and that state. He sort of is every possible role in the government, all within one man. And every morning when he wakes up, he has to decide, which role will I play today? I'm going to come back to this map in just a second. So German liberals were pretty conflicted over the whole issue of blood and iron, right? On the one hand, Bismarck's this brutal, illiberal ruler. On the other, he's kind of the best chance that they have to achieve this long cherished dream of unifying all of Germany, right? It's which side do you take? Which part of your values do you live up to? In the end, they really do agree to kind of trade their political freedoms, give up on some of their liberal ideals for the promise of Prussian military glory and someday German unification. But it wasn't going to be all that easy. Right? By the late 1860s, there's some obstacles to German unification. And the most important ones are states to the south, in particular Bavaria, as you can see right here, and Baden. So these are Catholic, predominantly Catholic German states. Prussia is predominantly Protestant. So there's a religious divide that goes back hundreds of years. But also there's political concern, right? Look how massive Prussia was. right? And look how powerful and influential their military and their economy are. Bavaria and Baden have very real concerns that they'll be swallowed up and lost. They'll lose all autonomy. They won't have any power whatsoever. So Bismarck needs to find a way to coax them in, right? He needs to find a way to bring them as gently as he can into the German Empire, the nascent German Empire. During the late 1860s, he tries to provoke a war with France that he thinks is going to spark nationalist feeling in all German-speaking lands, bring everybody together, make them all realize we're all just German in the end. We've got this common enemy, the French, and that will be the thing that creates finally the German empire, a unified German empire. So, to spark the war, this is realpolitik at its finest, right? Bismarck cooks up this kind of absurd but ultimately successful scheme. What he does is he takes a telegram from a French minister to the Prussian Emperor Wilhelm, and he makes it seem, he sort of reworks the wording and the punctuation, he changes some of the wording in the telegram to make it seem that the French minister has insulted Wilhelm, okay, and he hasn't. He then publishes this doctored telegram in all of the state-controlled newspapers that he operates, and the telegram, known as the EMS dispatch, EMS dispatch for the place where it was sent, begins to sort of spark all of these feelings of woundedness among German people. They feel affronted. How dare this French minister attack our emperor, right? Or a German-speaking emperor, whether or not we're Prussian. Okay, and it also brings up a lot of very old, going back to the Napoleonic Wars, French, anti-French feelings. Right? There's a lot of hatred for France in Central Europe. So within weeks, pro-war demonstrators are flooding the streets of Berlin. They're also flooding the streets of Paris. Right? The French are like, we didn't do that. That's not a legitimate cause for war, or that's not a legitimate telegram. How dare you say this? It is a cause for war. And so Napoleon III, Emperor of France, he's mobilizing his army, and troops are mobilizing in Prussia as well, and thus begins the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 and 1871. True to Bismarck's prediction, Bavaria and Baden, here in the south, they joined forces and they rush into the Prussian side. Okay. The Prussian army crushes, by the way, this image, I should say very quickly, this is obviously a caricature of Bismarck doing exactly the work I've just been talking about, right? He's trying to stitch together all of these different German-speaking lands, bring them into one unified, in this case, quilt or sheet or curtain or something like that. The Prussian army crushes the French in short order. It seizes Paris in January of 1871. Victorious German princes and generals, they assemble here at the Palace of Versailles, right outside of Paris, the place we've talked about many times. This is the palace of Louis XIV, XV, XVI. It is the place where the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was declared. It is the place where the tennis court oath had been sworn by the French revolutionaries, so a central place in the history of absolutism and revolution, but especially in the history of France. And there, all of these German notables, they grant the Prussian king Wilhelm I the new title of Emperor of a United Germany. Okay, and it's very symbolic to do this at Versailles. Right? Not only is it a really stomping on the face of the French people and really rubbing their faces in the fact that they've been defeated, but it's also suggesting that this home of the old authoritarian king of Europe, Louis XIV, the Sun King, right, sort of mastermind of absolutism, is now giving birth to a new dominant figure on the continent, right? A German king and a German nation, okay? So the nationalism on display in both Italy and in Germany is quite different than what we've discussed earlier in the semester. Instead of bubbling up from the masses, Cavour and Bismarck have co-opted and manipulated the sentiment of nationalism to serve their political purposes, right? This isn't romantic nationalism really at all, although what we find is very powerful people have learned to use nationalism to serve their interests, right? It's shifted from an ideology of liberation to one of political and militaristic determination. And particularly in the case of Germany, nationalism has really become illiberal, right? It's authoritarian, it's opposed to the will of the majority, it's opposed to the free exchange of ideas, and it's very much driven by war and violence. One very important consequence of these unifications is that the gentle balance of power that had been established at the Congress of Vienna and sort of maintained, often violently maintained, but maintained nonetheless for much of the 19th century, has now collapsed. France, the old stalwart power of Europe, is totally humiliated. Austria has lost a lot of its influence in Central Europe, and in Italy it's very weakened. Italy is politically united, but it remains internally divided. And in the heart of Europe, we have this new premier power, Germany, right? It's wealthy, it's extremely confident, and it's extremely militaristic. And this is a very dangerous combination. This is really going to strike fear in the hearts of all of the other great powers of the continent. Let's shift gears now. Let's talk about imperialism. Imperialism is the domination, political, economic, cultural, of one country or nation at the hands of another. It's an exploitative political arrangement. It's based on completely enforced inequality. And often this inequality is based in ideas of racial difference, okay? And imperialism had existed in some form or another for a couple of hundred years, at least in Western Europe, our contemporary understanding of imperialism, right? We know about the colonization of the Americas by powerful European absolutist governments. We talked a little bit about mercantilism, the economic system where colonies are forced to support the mother country. In the year 1500, Europeans controlled about 7% of the world's territory, and by 1800, that figure had risen to 35%. And that shows that early wave of colonization, right? But the real age of imperialism doesn't really take off until the late 19th century. By 1914, European governments controlled 84% of the earth. Britain is a nation of just 120,000 square miles, and it controlled an empire of 9 million square miles. Okay, so something happens that creates this imperial urge, an imperialistic urge among the powerful nations of Europe to go around the world, to conquer new territory, to extract new resources, to enforce ideas of racial inequality, racial difference. Why, right? What was it that did this? Imperialism has existed in some form or another for generations. What is it about the late Victorian period that inspires imperialism? A lot of causes for this, and you're reading about this in your primary sources. You can read about this in books, but I think there's three really crucial causes that we want to consider. The first one is industrialization. Right? As we've discussed, the Industrial Revolution stimulated lots of new forms of production, but it also, and we talked about this in our discussion of the middle class, it created new forms of demand, right? all of these new and exciting goods have to find buyers, right? Industrial capitalism always has to create demand. It can never sort of rest and say, we've created the best things, we're good, right? You have to find ways that are often artificial of stimulating demand. And you also always have to find new resources, right? You will run out of resources at some point. So you have to kind of open new frontiers. So this process, the production, the need for resources, the need for demand, encourages governments, encourages businesses to go out and seek new sources of raw material, new sources of cheap labor. And all of this is really badly shaken in the year 1873 when there is a Great Depression. Okay, this is the Great Depression before the Great Depression that you've often heard about in the 1930s. This depression lasts into the 1890s in some form or another. It dramatically shakes the powerful economies of Europe and the Americas. And so to spark their economies, European states, they go in search of what are called sheltered markets. This is an economist's term. And what it means is it's a market that can't control the inflow of goods or the outflow of resources, right? It can't, for example, impose tariffs. It can't restrict trade in any way with taxation or anything like that. A more powerful country can do this. And in fact, many powerful countries did do this in the late 19th century in order to protect their domestic economy. Europe finds these sheltered markets overseas, right? These are vast tracts of land that are sort of gobbled up by European countries, always at gunpoint. As one French newspaper put it, every gunshot overseas opens another outlet for French industry. Okay. So another engine of imperial expansion was national pride or sentiment, something we're talking a lot about this semester. It's the same force that proved so valuable in the unification of Italy and Germany. European politicians proclaimed it a matter of national pride that they would spread their flags into new lands, subdue foreign people, and enrich themselves. This was the mark, they often argued, of being a great country. What does it take to be a great country? You have to go abroad. You have to conquer foreign people. You have to conquer foreign lands. And this is very attractive to many different countries in Europe for different reasons, right? France is totally humiliated by the Franco-Prussian War. And so they have to restore their honor. They have to go and win wars against people who are totally unprepared to fight them against them. Britain is threatened by this rising power of Germany and concerned about maintaining its dominance, not only of Europe, but of the world. Germany can build on its momentum. It can continue to strike fear in Europeans and maintain its own dominance. And Italy, this new nation on the scene, it can prove its belonging to the community of nations if it conquers places like Libya and Eritrea. Underlying all of this national sentimentality and all this belief, this sort of urge to be great, is a third factor, right, which is racism. We talked last week about the idea of social Darwinism, the belief that humans were locked in a struggle for survival and that white Europeans had competitive advantages that justified their domination, their exploitation of others. This belief also justified imperialism. It was merely, from the imperialist perspective, a biological imperative to dominate weaker people. We're just doing what we naturally do, okay? We're seizing land, we're exploiting resources, we're demanding subservience, right? Alfred Lord Milner, he's a British colonial administrator, he's an ardent imperialist. He gives voice to this sentiment when he explains British dominance in South Africa. Here's what he said: "The white man must rule because he is elevated by many, many steps above the black man, steps which it will take the latter centuries to climb, and which the vast bulk of the black population may never be able to climb at all." Right? So he's drawing on this Darwinian idea of evolution, and he's justifying the extraordinary power that he and men like him are amassing on the African continent. Right? There's so much to deal with, and there's so much that's sort of difficult to conceive in Milner's argument. But I think the most outrageous and aspect of this argument, and this is something that comes up a lot in this week's primary sources, is the way that Europeans who shared this kind of belief convinced themselves that they were actually being generous, that they were committing acts of good through imperial conquest. Right? It was a way of giving civilization to those who lacked it. Take up the white man's burden, is what the poet Rudyard Kipling said. To serve your captive's need, to wait in heavy harness on flurried folk and wild. Your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Right? Bring civilization, bring order, bring wisdom to these people who are somewhere between a devil and a child. Okay? It's all of these factors combined that contribute to the so-called scramble for Africa. The scramble was the rapid conquest of Africa by Europeans between the 1870s and the early 20th century. In just 30 years, between 1875 and 1905, Europeans increased their control of Africa from 10% of the continent to 90%. Here is Africa in 1880. What you see, a lot of small independent states scattered across the entire continent. You see some European presence here. There's a little bit, right? This Congo is a colony of France at this point. You see Portugal has control over Angola, which it's exercised in some form or another since the 15th century. Britain has established its foothold in South Africa. But for the most part, this is sort of a patchwork of European presence and African independence. The Ottoman Empire, of course, has control here over much of North Africa. But now look at the early 20th century. Right? There is almost no independent African presence left except for here, Ethiopia. Okay, almost the rest of the continent is entirely controlled by, here we have France in the northwest, we have Britain from Egypt, almost uninterrupted, all the way to South Africa. And so this is rapid and almost complete domination. Europeans established 30 new colonies. They covered 10 million square miles of land. That counts for about 110 million people. Imperialism is a worldwide process, but Africa is where it's just most striking. What else is on the table here? So Britain claims Egypt to protect its investment in the Suez Canal, which had been completed in 1869 off the top of my head. And that carves a path between Britain through the Mediterranean and then all the way to India, right? So Britain has a connection to the sort of jewel of its empire. France claims the Horn of Africa, which gives it a presence in the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. Belgium rapidly expands its control over Congo, which is this sort of, I'm colorblind, but it looks purplish or pinkish to me, this sort of heartland here, this massive territory. It's eventually able to link the heartland all the way to the coast, and that gives it access to just the incredible rubber and mining resources that Congo has. So a lot of this is geopolitical strategy, right? A lot of this is trying to make sure you control the map and make sure you have linkages from your African colonies to ports, to colonies in other parts of the world. And it's a scramble because Europeans are racing to claim both markets and materials, right? For Europeans, Africa is just resources, right? It's a source. It's like food for the European appetite. You want to scramble to get get what's yours from the table, right? Out of fear of losing out, in 1884, European powers convene a conference in Berlin, which allows them to lay down some ground rules. They decide that any European state claiming land in Africa must establish what was called effective occupation. That is, you must have a real presence in the country. You can't just plant a flag and say it's yours. So you have to commit, right? You have to send human resources and capital into this colony. But other than that, there's not a great deal of conflict between European powers over Africa, right? It's remarkably cooperative. This is a very notable point. There are no African representatives at the Berlin Conference, right? So a meeting intended to decide the entire fate of the second largest continent in the world, a place that's home to 110 million people, and there is not a representative from that place. Okay, that shows you the sort of arrogance of imperialism. The continent is carved up in total disregard of its millions and millions of people. In most cases, this disregard could take sort of gruesome, violent form. Consider Belgium's claims in Congo. I think we read a little bit about this week, but I'll just expand on that. Technically, Congo was not a Belgian colony. Instead, it was the legal, personal property of the Belgian King Leopold. It was home to 15 million people, at least, right? The reading we did this week suggests some estimates were as high as 40 million. Few were lower than 20 million. And of those people, all of those people became essentially the personal serfs of Leopold. They were forced to labor extracting valuable rubber and then as well as mining materials or producing food for the rubber producing areas of the colony. And Leopold's agents were authorized to mutilate people who did not meet labor quotas. In many cases, limbs were removed as a warning to others. Work hard or pay dearly. Sources describe whole baskets of limbs and extremities placed outside rubber collecting stations as a warning to rubber workers. Leopold's interest earned him about $15 million a year, which is an outrageously high sum for the 1890s. There's a fortune historians have claimed that cost at least 5 million lives and probably closer to 10 million lives, right? It's essentially a genocide in the name of wealth creation. It's a Holocaust. And abuses like this were made possible in large part by technology, as well as just complete human disregard for the welfare of others. Let's think about the machine gun. Okay, the machine gun, or a machine gun, was invented by Hiram Maxim in 1884. The Maxim gun, it could fire 11 bullets per second. So in 1890, Europe's major powers agreed to ban the sale of this weapon to any African, right? So colonial powers could maintain control with almost no resistance. Whatever happens, one British poet wrote, we've got the Maxim gun and they have not, right? So what does this mean? A small force of Europeans, 20 or 40 or 100 men, can suddenly conquer thousands and thousands and thousands, right? At the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, British forces sustained 40 fatalities. And this is a massive battle. They sustained 40 fatalities and they killed 11,000 Sudanese warriors. None of this is without criticism. I don't want you to walk away from this lecture and imagine, wow, everybody in Europe was just head in the sand, or they were just complete psychopaths, right? Criticism was actually very common of imperialism. People recognized that this was outrageous, that it was unjust, that it violated any basic norm of human decency. Insightful Europeans recognized that violence and conquest really didn't serve most European people's interests, right? They served a very small sliver of European society. Um, the British journalist J.A. Hobson, who covered British war efforts in South Africa, claimed such wars were, here's what he said, orchestrated and fought for the preservation of finance capitalism at the expense of the working class, as well as at the expense of native people who are completely destroyed by this, right? And it is the working class of Europe who are the ones who fight these battles, the ones who are at a young age sent to very far away, very strange places to do the heavy lifting here. No one, Hobson realized, would die so that a Manchester cotton millionaire could sell cheap shirts in South Africa, right? That's just not a winning argument to send someone to war, but they might die. And here is where he was very critical of how imperialism was sold, right? Average people might die for ideas such as national honor or masculine bravery, right? They might, and it was for these reasons, I should say, that European governments saturated their societies with nationalist pleas to fight for the nation, right? They play the anthem, they wave the flag, and they say, this is your national destiny. Okay, you must leave home and you must go to Africa and you must do the good work of the country. I'll be interested to see what you all think as we read imperialist documents this week, or documents that relate to imperialism. I want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about philosophy. Like I said at the beginning, we're moving quickly here this week. We've got a lot to cover. This is a very dense lecture, and I apologize for that. So, what are the new ideas that are circulating? In addition to imperialism and anti-imperialism, what other ideas are floating around in European society at this time? How are people thinking? How are people writing? We're going to pick this discussion up again next week, but I just wanted to throw a few ideas on the table to get this going, and these ideas are relevant to some of the reading you did this week. The most important intellectual development we've talked about this semester is the Enlightenment, right? I keep coming back to the Enlightenment. How did conservatives think about the Enlightenment? How did romantics think about the Enlightenment? Liberals, did the Enlightenment still matter, right? Keep coming back to this question. And if there was one key Enlightenment idea, it was that the self was eminently knowable, right? That the world is rational, that the world can be understood. That's the essence of Enlightenment thinking, right? So it's anti-superstition. At the end of the 19th century, there's a number of European thinkers who begin doubting this. Okay, they challenge this idea and they start to stress that mankind is actually fundamentally irrational. We're going to discuss how Sigmund Freud relates to this movement next week, but right now I just want to consider another principal figure of this challenge to the Enlightenment, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had served in the Franco-Prussian War, and for the rest of his life, he was really distrustful of nationalism and patriotism. He was plagued by ill health later in life. He suffered from neurological deterioration. He went, in the parlance of the time, he went mad. He, in the last 10 years of his life, was either hospitalized entirely or under the care of his sister. So his ideas, especially after his mental health was declining in the 1880s, they could be sort of difficult to follow. They could be contradictory. They could be wildly inflammatory. Much of what we read this week from Nietzsche is wildly inflammatory. And the essence of his philosophy, if there is an essence to his philosophy, was rejection, right? Rejection of everything that the late Victorian era seemed to stand for. All of the political philosophies, all of the developments, the religious beliefs, these things were obstacles, he argued, to true human development and a fuller and richer existence. So Nietzsche rejected liberalism. He rejected socialism because he believed that humans were inherently unequal. And to say that they were equal was to sort of waste good, talented people. He ridiculed the Victorian faith in science and progress. He condemned as hypocritical the teachings of Christianity. In short, Nietzsche rejected any belief in a higher truth or power. The only truth, he wrote, was that we are all naked, isolated individuals living in a godless world. He's a cheery sort of guy, right? He's the guy you want at your party. And he identified culprits for Europeans' inability to see this essential truth. Culprit one was hyper-rationalism, which smothered the spontaneity and joy of life. In a way, this is kind of similar to Romanticism, but Nietzsche despised the sort of all men are brothers, we all have a common fate and destiny thinking of Romanticism. He's an individualist to his core, right? The cure for hyper-rationalism, according to Nietzsche, was an embrace of passion and will, right? Your emotive forces, your instincts. A second culprit for this sort of inability to see the truth was Christianity, which imposed prohibitions on human passion. It forced people to conform to what Nietzsche saw as unnatural norms, right? Christianity depicted as sinful all of the things that Nietzsche said were actually virtuous, actually the essence of human life. Nietzsche famously argued that God is dead. And what he meant by that was that modern society had outgrown the usefulness of Christianity and needed to move on. When that was done, new types of people would emerge, would be free to emerge. These were superior to the weaklings of the Victorian age, right? These new people whom Nietzsche called the Overman or the Superman, in German, the Übermensch, will one day break from social mediocrity, and they're going to create their own values. While Christians had internalized the dictum, thou shalt not, the Übermensch will instinctively claim, I will, right? What makes the Übermensch powerful, according to Nietzsche, is that he's not guided by reason, he's not guided by morality, but by a will to power. He does not turn the other cheek. He does not love thy neighbor. He makes a fist and he smashes his neighbor. Okay, here's what he wrote. To behold suffering gives one pleasure, but to cause another to suffer affords an even greater pleasure. To witness suffering is pleasurable. To impose or cause suffering is even more pleasurable. All kinds of groups and individuals find inspiration in Nietzsche's work. Anarchists, revolutionaries, even socialists, although he despises them, they still find inspiration in his total rejection of the status quo. And they feel justified in the means that they take to overthrow the status quo, right? This is an age, the late Victorian age is the birth of terrorism, as we've come to understand it, right? Terrorists throw bombs at kings and emperors. They try to assassinate powerful people. They do so, including in the United States. And they find justification in Nietzsche's writing for those actions. Others see his belief in a sort of superior man as validating, right? They adopt his philosophy and style new political visions from it. The most prominent group to really share some of these ideas or be influenced by these ideas is, of course, the Nazis, who are going to begin taking shape in the 1920s. Nietzsche himself, I've read in some cases that he was an anti-Semite. I've read in others that he criticized anti-Semitism. I'm not exactly sure where to land on that, but I do know that he did not necessarily see the Übermensch ideal in racial terms, because races are groups, right? And Nietzsche's saying groups aren't the future, right? It's an individualistic concept. It's an individual ethos. The Übermensch is a single man who can break free from the society. But it's not difficult for Adolf Hitler, young Adolf Hitler, or others to to be inspired by the idea of the Übermensch and apply it to racial groups. So that's where we're going to leave it right now. That's the state of Europe in the late Victorian period. It's an obviously tumultuous and frankly terrifying time in the history of Europe. And we'll pick back up with what all of these trends are going to lead to next week. So thanks for watching, everybody. And I look forward to, as always, discussing all of this with you on the forum. Thank you.